According to published reports, the U.S. State Department has issued an apology for promoting a controversial Muslim scholar whose organization has reportedly backed Hamas and endorsed a fatwa authorizing the murder of U.S. soldiers in Iraq. Joining us to talk more about this incredible story is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. It's an organization that first drew attention to this issue and the controversial views of the person involved when it announced that this sheikh was scheduled to visit the White House back in June of last year. By the way, Dr. Jasser is himself a former lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy, vice chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, although the statements on shows like this are his own. He's also author of a powerful book called A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. He is a physician currently in private practice, and his Twitter feed is at Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser, always great to have you with me. How are you?
Great. It's good to be with you, Don. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Tell us this remarkable story of this scholar, Muslim scholar, controversial. Why is he controversial, and what was his engagement, involvement with the State Department?
Yeah, I mean, this guy is well known to some of the leadership of Islamist organizations in the West. His name is Abdallah Bin Bayyah, and he is originally from Mauritania and is part of what I would call sort of the higher echelon of Islamic scholars of the Brotherhood Network throughout the world. And here's a guy who, on the one hand, can be purported as being moderate because he talks about elevating the status of women and talks about democracy. But ultimately, he's hand in hand with Yusuf Qaradawi, who's one of the other main imams you'll see on Al Jazeera, and others, who has basically knows how to say some things right to appear modern, but when in fact the core ideology is of draconian Islamism, where they'll say that terrorism is forbidden except in occupied lands such as quote-unquote Israel or Iraq or Afghanistan, where the foreign fighters are invading. So their moral hypocrisy, if you will, is all about being anti-West. It's not about actually being moral leaders. They are very anti-American, and some of the Islamic leaders in America have led the White House and the State Department to use these guys as so-called windows into modernity, when in fact it's all a camouflage. Bin Bayyah has, if you look deeper into his websites, has apologetics about slavery in Mauritania, has praised Hamas, and does not consider them a terrorist organization, and has actually endorsed the killing of American soldiers in Iraq. So when the State Department announced that he was in town in Washington this week, they were saying how he had come to the White House in July, when we had actually first reported our concern with him, as did Adam Credo at the Washington Beacon. And, you know, the bottom line is that once they were called on it, they removed their tweets about it and said, oh, we apologize, we didn't consult with our counterterrorism bureau. And it really reveals the disconnect between really in the State Department on really what side we should be taking within the House of Islam in this whole battle of ideas.
And sadly, these are my views. I'd like your comments. Sadly, these problems, this treating Islam, radical Islam, as less than other than the threat that it really is, doesn't simply start or stop with this administration. The previous administration, it was one of the areas that I personally found of merited criticism on the part of the Bush administration, that they seemed to refuse to take a very clear-cut black and white stand on what we knew to be the background of some of these forces that worked not only overseas but in our own country.
Absolutely, and Don, you really hit the nail on the head, because if you look, this Sheikh Bin Bayyah, one of his main students in the West is Hamza Yusuf, who runs the Zaytuna Institute. And Hamza Yusuf was trained by him, and Hamza Yusuf was in the White House right after 9/11, shoulder to shoulder with President Bush, so-called talking about moderation. And still till today, almost 13 years after 9/11, we consider the moderates to be those who are anti-Al-Qaeda and against the militant Islamist groups. And yet we find that the biggest problem that the Brotherhood had with Al-Qaeda was their means. It wasn't their ends of wanting to create an Islamic neo-caliphate or Islamic democracies where Sharia law runs the government rather than secular liberalism and governments based in reason. So this is the issue, is that we are siding with those who have a common enemy, which is Al-Qaeda and the militant Wahhabis, if you will, but these are not our allies. We may have common enemies, but they're certainly not our allies, and we're working with the wrong imams and clerics because we want those that are for freedom, for the grassroots on the ground, like the ones in Egypt that were against the Brotherhood last summer. But we're not doing that. We're still using sort of the lowest hanging fruit and those that are passing fatwas or opinions against the Al-Qaeda leaders that are really in a battle for the Islamic supremacy that we want neither side of.
We're going to come back with more, and always good and informative to talk with Zuhdi Jasser and to get a better understanding of the real issues at stake here. And we'll give you more information about how you can reach his organization, partner with it, and so forth when we come back. The Don Kroah Show on WAVA. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, my guest, president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Their website is AIFdemocracy.org, AIFdemocracy.org. Also author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. His Twitter feed is at Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. That's ZUHDIJASSER. Dr. Jasser, as we were talking, I was reminded again, as you were mentioning Egypt, for case in point, and other places, it seems, again, not only under this administration, but certainly more so than ever before, we have ended up on the wrong side of these issues. Talk from your perspective about Saddam Hussein, case in point. He was certainly not a radical Muslim in the sense we're discussing. He was, I guess, a secular Muslim, and also the same with Gaddafi in Libya. And we created vacuums there into which the radical elements rushed and filled the void. Am I right?
Yes, and the paradigm that I would just beg you and your listeners to start to change is this paradigm that the Middle East is stuck between a death match between two evils, and there is a third side to this battle. And that is the side of the people, the side of liberty, the side of moderation and modernity, a side that still doesn't have a sense of what it is. And for too long, you've had, look at Assad in Syria. On the one hand, they claim to be victims of Al-Qaeda and militants, and yet Assad is on the same side as Hezbollah in Iran, which is the world's largest feeder of radical Islam, but from the Shiite side rather than the Sunni side. So these dictators have created a pressure cooker, if you will, in each of their countries, intentionally radicalizing their populations so that they can claim a reason in which to mandate some of the most draconian laws and actually use militant Islam as a mechanism, a tool, as an opium of the masses, if you will. And lost in the middle is the third side, which is the side of liberty. And if America and the West doesn't find that third side, ultimately the liberty-minded Muslims are going to disappear. And I've called the president's policy in the Middle East a Darwin policy, which is simply to let the most powerful, the ones with the most weapons and the most corruption and the most money to survive, while the good folks on the streets who are trying to get a grapple on something different from what they've been rammed down their throats since the end of World War II, they're trying to mature. And social media is giving them the mechanisms to do that. But right now, since we're out of the equation, all they're getting is Russia and Iran and China feeding the continuation of a Darwin policy, which is the worst surviving.
And back to an earlier point of this discussion, how did Bin Bayyah end up at the White House when, as you note, he served as vice president of the International Union of Muslim Scholars, and explain the background of that organization? That itself should have disqualified him from any White House welcome, shouldn't it?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, is because right now the filter for who goes into the White House and who are the allies for us in this fight is he made statements critical of Al-Qaeda and that talking about these militant organizations as being, un-Islamic, etc. But then they look at the larger political movement that he's a part of, and he comes right out of the trough of the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and they ignored his other statements that calls for killing American soldiers in Iraq and endorses Hamas and these other things. They ignore those things because right now to them, he is a voice of moderation against al-Qaeda. And because that's such a narrow vision, and because they're not talking to Muslims other than the Brotherhood-type Muslims in the lobby groups in Washington for the OIC that are working with Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and others, they're not realizing that many Muslims don't look at Bin Bayyah as a leader. They see him as a corrupt politician in a robe, and no different than the Khomeinists on the Shiite side. And ultimately, this is where we have to start taking the administration to task on what is the filter they're using to determine who our allies are in the Muslim world.
Well, as you close your column by quoting him, I would call this the understatement of the week in this regard. Terrorism analyst Patrick Poole condemned the State Department's tweet last week, stating it must more carefully vet the Muslim leaders it promotes. Well, hello.
Exactly. We don't have, right now their vetting is simply looking at it through the narrow tunnel of who's anti-Al-Qaeda, who's anti-Boko Haram, who's anti-whatever flavor of the month is the current militant group, then they must be on our side. Forget the ideologies that are truly the beginning of radicalization, which is an anti-Western philosophy, anti-freedom, anti-woman. The fatwas that this imam has put out, he talks about women's rights, about hijab, to protect them from their innocence. And it's all a very condescending, misogynistic teachings that really the White House was getting behind by endorsing these guys. And when they're called on it, they simply, oh, I'm sorry, we'll delete the tweet. Well, it's beyond the tweet. It's about a policy that is completely devoid of reason as far as who we work with in the areas that are really full of Muslims trying to do the work we're doing to work with liberty.
And on that note, I want us to go back to your organization before we have to let you go, because it seems to me, as with every battle that really is going to matter for the American people and our children and grandchildren, we, the American people, have to get better informed on these issues, which is part of why we are honored to have guests such as yourself on to help us. But the average American really doesn't even realize what's going on, and we need to inform ourselves so as to hold our politicians' feet to the fire on these issues, because to do otherwise is to lose this country eventually.
You couldn't be more right, Don. And I compare it to where we were in the Cold War, right at the end of World War II. We didn't really know that there was going to be a longer battle against the Soviets. And once we got into the 60s and 70s, I'm sure most Americans wouldn't have said that, well, as long as they're not Soviet communists, let's work with the Chinese or the El Salvadorian communists. That wouldn't matter as long as it's not Soviets. Well, this is where we are with the Islamist conflict. We need to realize that it's not just Al-Qaeda, it's not just the Brotherhood. Any Islamists, from Jamaat Islami in Pakistan to Boko Haram to Islamists all over the world, in America too, they're not on our side. And we need to find a new paradigm of which Muslims are working for modernity and liberalism. Our American Islamic Forum for Democracy is doing that. We have an American Islamic Leadership Coalition that's also building coalitions in the West to be available, and yet the government doesn't use us.
Well, thank you for being available to shows like this one. I saw you on television the other night debating someone out of New York. I forget the man's name, but as usual, I thought you quit yourself well, as the saying goes, and I appreciate your work.
Well, thank you, Don. I really appreciate you covering this and the courage it takes to do that. Thank you.
All right. Have a good day. We'll talk again.
Anytime. Appreciate it.
Again, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Here's their website. If you want to get informed and really get informed with the proper and accurate and complete information, it's scholars such as this man who can help you. He is a Muslim by his birth and faith, but he is, well, you've heard him. He's calling for freedom. He helped fight for freedom in this country as a member of the U.S. Navy, lieutenant commander. and continues that work under AIFdemocracy.org. AIFdemocracy.org. I'm sure he and his staff could use your encouragement, and if you choose to partner with them, I'm sure that would help as well.